February 1945. Iwo Jima. A Marine crouches in a shell hole cut into black volcanic sand, one hand pressed against a field radio, the other gripping the handset like it is the last dry thing on Earth. Around him, telephone wire lies in pieces, antennas snap under artillery fire, radio channels drown in static, and somewhere offshore, commanders are waiting for one thing they cannot see from their ships. The real battlefield. The Marine does not open a code book. He does not crank a cipher machine. He does not spell a message letter by letter while men bleed on the beach. He just speaks, fast, calm, in a language Japanese intelligence can hear clearly, but cannot enter. On the command ship, another Navajo Marine hears the words, turns them back into battlefield English, and places the message into the hands of an officer. A machine gun nest is marked. A mortar trap is avoided. A destroyer shifts fire. A company that was about to walk into death is suddenly turned away from it. All of it happens in minutes, not hours. Minutes. In the first 48 hours of Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo Code Talkers sent and received more than 800 messages without a single reported error. No broken code, no captured meaning. No delay long enough to turn an order into a tombstone. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, would later say the line that explains the whole story. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. But the miracle was not that the code was complicated. The miracle was that it was alive. It had lungs, memory, fear, a rifle, a radio, and a voice. This was the weapon the enemy could hear, but never understand. And it was born because, in the Pacific War, the United States had run into a problem no machine had solved. The problem was not just secrecy. It was time. Every battle in the Pacific forced American commanders into a brutal choice: the lock or the clock. If they chose the clock, they could speak quickly. Plain English, simple map codes, short field phrases, orders passed in seconds. Move left, need mortar fire, enemy on ridge. But speed had a price. The Japanese were listening, not casually, professionally. Their signal intelligence units studied American radio habits with patience and skill. They learned the rhythm of call signs, they caught repeated phrases, they recognized panic. They understood enough English to turn an American transmission into a Japanese opportunity. A fast message could save a platoon. It could also tell the enemy exactly where that platoon was dying. So commanders could choose the lock: encryption, cipher procedure, mechanical secrecy. The U.S. military had machines for that world. At high levels, it had powerful electromechanical systems. In the field, Marines used smaller devices like the M209, a portable cipher machine that looked like a lunch pail, built by a watchmaker. It could protect a message, but it could not protect a moment. A Marine under fire had to write the message. A trained operator had to set the wheels and pins. Then each letter had to be converted, one crank at a time. The encrypted text had to be transmitted, received, decoded, checked, carried to the person who could act on it. 10 minutes could become 30. 30 could become an hour. An hour on an island battlefield was not a delay, it was another war. Because in that hour, the machine gun had moved, the ridge had fallen, the assault had stalled. The men who needed the answer might no longer be alive to hear it. That was the trap. Fast messages were exposed. Secure messages were late. The Marines were built to attack fast, land fast, adjust fast, and close with the enemy before he could recover. But in the early Pacific campaigns, they were often fighting with a nervous system that moved too slowly for their own muscles. They could hit, they could advance, but they could not always talk fast enough to survive the next minute. The lock and the clock were pulling the Marine Corps apart. And the solution did not come from a bigger machine. It came from a man who remembered a language. Philip Johnston was not the kind of person the Marine Corps expected to solve a battlefield communications crisis. He was a civilian engineer, the son of missionaries, a man who had grown up around the Navajo Nation and learned Diné Bizaad, the Navajo language, as a child. He understood something the cryptographers did not. Navajo was not simply hard for outsiders. It was almost unreachable under wartime conditions. It had sounds, structure, and grammar completely foreign to Japanese or European language training. It was not sitting in enemy hands as a convenient military dictionary, and only a small number of non-Navajo people could speak it well enough to matter. So Johnston brought the idea to Marine officers in 1942, not as poetry, as tactics. Use Navajo voices to carry battlefield messages faster than any machine and safer than any field code. The officers were skeptical. They should have been. A war was being fought with radios, rotors, wiring, code sheets, and procedure. Now a civilian was saying the answer might be a human voice from the desert. So they tested it. A message was handed to Navajo speakers. A typical battlefield message. Enemy machine gun on the right flank. Destroy. One man spoke it into a field telephone. Another Navajo speaker in another room heard it and turned it back into English. The answer came back correct. The stopwatch mattered more than the applause. About 20 seconds. A message that could take a cipher machine the better part of half an hour had moved almost at the speed of thought. That was when the Marine Corps saw the shape of the weapon. It was not just a language. It was a way to beat the enemy's decision cycle, a way to act before the listener could understand, a way to make time itself secure. The Marines authorized a trial group, not 200 men, not an army of specialists, 29. The first 29 Navajo recruits arrived in 1942 and went through Marine boot camp like everyone else. They learned to march, shoot, obey, endure. Then, after the ordinary training was over, their real work began behind guarded doors. They had to build something that did not yet exist, because Navajo, by itself, was not enough. If one code talker simply translated English into ordinary Navajo, a captured Navajo speaker might eventually help the enemy. So the first 29 made a second lock inside the first lock, a code inside the language. They created a military vocabulary out of remembered images. A submarine became an iron fish. A battleship became a whale. A fighter plane became a hummingbird. A dive bomber became a chicken hawk. A tank became a tortoise. A grenade became a potato. The words sounded familiar to a Navajo ear, but their battlefield meanings belonged only to trained code talkers. That was the genius. Even a fluent Navajo speaker who had not learned the code might hear the transmission and feel the language in his bones, but still not know the war inside it. Names, coordinates, and unusual words were handled through a phonetic alphabet built from Navajo words assigned to English letters, and everything had to be memorized. No code book in the foxhole, no cheat sheet in the command post, no paper list for the Japanese to capture. The code lived where the enemy could not search it, in the minds of young Marines. Which meant the most advanced, secure communication system in the Pacific could be destroyed by one bullet. The first real proof came in the Solomons. Guadalcanal was not just a battle for an airfield. It was a battle against heat, rot, jungle, hunger, and radio failure. The island swallowed signals, rain killed batteries, jungle ridges broke line of sight, and the Japanese were always listening. At first, many Marines did not know what to make of the Navajo operators attached to their units. Then the shooting started. A company would be pinned down, a forward unit would need artillery, a commander would try the old channels and get delay, static, or confusion. Then a Navajo Marine would take the handset. He would listen once, transmit once, and the answer would come back fast enough to matter. A mortar barrage landed where it was needed. A patrol changed direction before an ambush closed. A supply route shifted before nightfall. The strange voices became the most trusted voices on the net, because they did not just carry words, they carried timing. On the Japanese side, the effect was frightening. Their listeners could record the transmissions. They could replay them, slow them down, compare them, send them to linguists. But the voices did not break into neat little code groups. They sounded like a living language, moving too quickly to freeze. And every time that language appeared, American action followed. A hidden gun position was hit. A counterattack was anticipated. A Japanese unit moving in darkness found Marines waiting. The enemy could hear the door opening, but they could not see the room behind it. Then the Japanese found what looked like a key. After the fall of Bataan, they held a Navajo soldier named Joe Kiyomiya as a prisoner of war. He was not a Marine code talker. He had been captured before he ever learned the code. But to Japanese intelligence, one detail in his background looked electric. He was Navajo. They played him recordings. They expected translation. Kiyomiya listened, and what he heard must have been one of the strangest experiences of the war. The sounds were his language. The rhythm was his language. Some of the words were words he knew. Whale, potato, chicken hawk, ironfish. But the meaning was wrong. The words had been lifted into another world. He could hear Navajo and still not hear the message. So when the interrogators demanded an answer, he told them the truth. He did not know. They did not believe him. They punished him. They tried again. Still, he could not unlock it. That was the moment the code proved its deepest strength. It was not protected only by Navajo. It was protected by Navajo men who had rebuilt Navajo into a battlefield machine without making it mechanical. A locked room inside a locked room. The Japanese had found a Navajo speaker. They still had not found the code. By 1943 and 1944, the Code Talkers were no longer an experiment. They were part of the Marine Corps' nervous system. From landing craft to command ships, from forward observers to division headquarters, Navajo voices stitched together battles that otherwise might have torn apart. At Tarawa, coral and fire made movement almost impossible. At Saipan and Peleliu, caves and ridges turned every yard into a separate fight. At each place, the same truth returned. A commander could not wait hours to understand what had happened 5 minutes ago. He needed a voice from the front line, a safe one, a fast one, a voice the enemy could not use against him. The Navajo Code Talkers became that voice, but their value created a new kind of danger. They were not carrying a machine. They were the machine. If a radio was destroyed, another radio could be issued. If a cipher device failed, another could be shipped. But if a code talker was killed, captured, or mistaken for the enemy, an entire channel of trust could vanish. And the war made that risk terrifyingly real. In the Pacific, exhausted Marines were trained to fear infiltration. Night attacks, sudden movement, a silhouette in the wrong place, a voice they did not recognize. Several Navajo Marines were mistaken for Japanese soldiers by their own side. Some were held at gunpoint, some were nearly shot before another Marine identified them. Imagine carrying the one voice your battalion depends on, and knowing that your own uniform might not be enough to save you. That is why some code talkers were assigned bodyguards, officially to protect them, to keep nervous Americans from making a fatal mistake, to keep snipers and chaos away from a priceless communications link. But veterans later remembered the darker shadow behind that protection. The code could not be allowed to walk alive into an enemy interrogation room. That fear tells you everything about what these men had become. Not mascots, not helpers, strategic assets, human vaults. The Marines depended on them so completely that their memories became guarded territory. The unbreakable code had a breakable body, and in February 1945, those bodies were sent toward Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was not a jungle like Guadalcanal. It was black sand, sulfur stink, ash slopes, and a mountain turned into a gun platform. The Japanese commander, Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had built the island into a fortress of caves, tunnels, pillboxes, and hidden artillery positions. The defenders were not arranged to throw the Marines back into the sea in one dramatic charge. They were arranged to bleed them, patiently, from under the ground. The first waves hit the beach and immediately began sinking into the volcanic sand. Vehicles bogged down. Men clawed for footing. Shells found the landing zones. Field telephone lines were laid and cut almost as soon as they touched the ground. Radios fought terrain, metal, sulfur, static, and fire. The old communications dilemma returned in its most brutal form. The Marines needed orders faster than the island could kill them, and ordinary systems were collapsing. Then the Navajo net came alive. A code talker in a crater reported a surviving pillbox. A code talker near a pinned company called for fire. Another passed movement orders between tanks and infantry before the sand turned them into targets. A forward observer saw a route about to become a mortar trap and sent the warning before the men entered it. The code did not make Iwo Jima easy, nothing could, but it made chaos answerable. It turned isolated screams into coordinated action. It gave commanders on ships a way to see through the eyes of men lying in the sand. And because the Japanese could not read the traffic, the defenders were forced to react to the explosions, not the intentions behind them. For 2 days, the 6 Navajo Code Talkers attached to the 5th Marine Division worked almost without rest. More than 800 messages, no reported errors, under fire, in smoke, in noise, in one of the most violent places on Earth. That number matters because it is not just a statistic. It is hundreds of moments where a delay did not become a death sentence. Hundreds of times the clock did not defeat the lock. Hundreds of times a human voice did what a machine could not do fast enough. When the flag went up on Mount Suribachi, the photograph became the image the world remembered. 6 Marines on a ridge, a flag leaning into the wind. A shape so powerful it turned into sculpture, stamp, poster, monument. But below that mountain, in shell holes and command posts, another image remained mostly unseen. Navajo Marines bent over radios, speaking a language that had once been punished in government schools, using that same language to guide the most modern military force in the world through fire. That is the part of the story that refuses to stay simple. Because the United States had spent years trying to pull Native children away from their languages, then, in a war for survival, it discovered that one of those languages could do what its machines could not. The country that had tried to silence Diné Bizaad needed it to win. And then, after the war, it silenced it again. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The guns stopped, men came home, parades filled streets, generals wrote memoirs, pilots became legends, ships became names children could recite. But the Navajo Code Talkers were not free to tell their families what they had done. The program remained classified, the vocabulary, the method, the missions, even the existence of the system. All of it had to stay secret. The military reason was clear. A code that had never been broken might be useful again. To reveal it was to spend a weapon that could still have value. So the men who had carried the fastest secure voice in the Pacific returned home with a story locked in their chests. A father might ask what his son had done. A wife might wonder why her husband woke at night. A child might hear only that he had been a radio man. A radio man. A true phrase, and a terrible understatement. Because how could he explain that a word for potato might mean grenade, that a whale might be a battleship, that the language some teachers had tried to beat out of children had become a shield over thousands of Marines. How could he explain that his greatest service depended on never describing it? Silence became the last order they obeyed. Not for a day, not for a campaign, for decades. The Code Talker program was not declassified until 1968. Only then could the story begin to move from memory into history. Only then could families understand that the quiet veteran at the table had not merely carried a radio. He had carried a weapon no enemy ever broke. Recognition came slowly, too slowly. Certificates, medals, ceremonies. Public honor for men who had already spent the best years of their lives keeping the truth hidden. But the delay cannot erase what they did. The Navajo Code Talkers solved the equation every commander in the Pacific feared. It gave the Marines speed without exposure, security without paralysis, a lock that moved as fast as the clock. And they did it with the one technology no factory could build. A living language, a remembered world, a human voice under fire. The Japanese heard the words, the Marines heard the meaning, and for 23 years after the war, America heard almost nothing at all. Their country had once tried to silence their language. Then it survived by listening to it, and when victory came, it asked them to be silent again.